In our previous video, we talked about a little bit about what SharePoint is. And there are lots of uses for SharePoint. And Microsoft has talked about getting rid of SharePoint, but it's really used a lot in nonprofit and enterprise sectors. So they haven't done anything with that yet. So there may be an instance where you are managing a SharePoint server. And there's two different ways to it. You've got SharePoint that can be deployed on-prem, or you've got SharePoint that can be deployed here through Office 365 in the cloud. All right. Now, we introduced some ideas about what SharePoint is and what you can do with it in the previous video. In this one, let's look at some basic policies and settings of SharePoint. Now, we're not going to go really deep into everything you can do with SharePoint and all of the configurations, but we want to give you enough to get you started. So I'm going to start by looking at policies. And some of these things can be set, by the way, on a per site basis, but we can also set them organizationally here. So I'm going to go to policies and let's look at our sharing policies. And notice these settings, use these settings to control sharing at the organizational level in SharePoint and OneDrive. We'll be able to override that on individual sites. So content can be shared with. And notice we have both the option for SharePoint and for OneDrive content. And here are options. Anyone, so users can share files and folders using links that don't require a sign-in, so they can literally share it with anyone. New or existing guests, the key thing here, guests must sign in. We can do only existing guests, so they have to be ones that are already in our organization's directory. Or, you know what, just no external sharing allowed. You got to keep it within the organization. And the way you'll do that is you'll just click and drag these to your different settings until you get exactly what you want. Notice, by the way, that when I move the SharePoint down, it also adjusts OneDrive. So SharePoint can be more permissive than OneDrive, but OneDrive cannot be more permissive than SharePoint. Just a little idiosyncrasy there. So I'm going to go ahead and set these both to existing guests. All right. And you'll notice you can further restrict sharing on individual sites. We'll look at that in a little bit. So more external sharing settings. Now, this is interesting. So we can limit by existing domain. Let's take a look at that one first. If I check that, then I can add domains, and I can add two different ones. Only allow specific domains or block specific domains. Now, only allow specific domains. Where you would use this is if you said, all right, we're going to be partnering with this other organization, so we are going to allow that otherorg.com. We're going to allow their domain, and you can allow sharing with them, but nobody else. And you can add more than one domain in here, obviously. But the idea is you can only share to people within those domains. Now, the flip side of this is going to be to block specific domains. So I don't want you sharing anything with that nasty organization, nastyorg.com. So they weren't nice to us. We're going to block you from sharing anything with them. Now, this I don't think is particularly effective. So let's say you have a user who wants to share something with a forbidden domain. They're talking to somebody, they're trying to share information, they try to share it, it blocks them because they're not allowed to share with that domain. They're on the phone with a person in the other domain who says, hey, why don't you share with my personal email then? And that, if it's on a different domain, that immediately bypasses it. So I don't think that's actually a particularly effective way to secure things. I think saying only allowing specific domains is much more effective. All right, I don't need that, so I'm going to go ahead and cancel that. So, allow only users in specific security groups to share externally. And the idea here is, I don't want everybody to, but I might have a couple of security groups, and I trust these ones to be able to share externally without compromising data or losing data that we need to keep proprietary. So here I can add a security group, and then that security group can then share with somebody else. So sales members can share with, and here's where I get to set anyone or authenticated guests only. All right, I'll go ahead and cancel that. So that's if I want specific people to. Here's another useful one, and I think this is actually a really good one. Guests must sign in using the same account to which the sharing invitations were sent. So when you share data, you send an invitation to a specific email address. And then they can respond to that invitation. And what this does is it says, okay, this makes it so that I don't share it with person A, who shares it with person B, who then tries to follow the link. Because it limits to guests must sign in using the same account that we sent the invitation to. So that's a good little security option there. We can allow guests to share items they don't own. Okay, we can uncheck that if we don't want to allow that to happen. And then people who use a verification code must re-authenticate after X number of days. So some good security options here, some of them a little bit better than others. All right, file and folder links. Move down a little bit farther. You can choose the type of link that's selected by default when users share file and folders. So by default, we can allow to, and the key thing here is this is by default, right? That can be overridden. So the idea here is by setting, here, let me show you what we don't want to do. I'm going to bump these security settings back up. I'm going to go back to allow sharing with anybody. Okay, now right here, choose the type of link that's selected by default. If this is by default, then what happens is you may accidentally have someone share information in a way they didn't intend to. So if you set it to default at a lower level, so only specific people, if that's the default sharing, then that doesn't mean they can't share at one of these two higher levels. It means it'll default to this one and they have to intentionally override it. Basically, it keeps somebody from accidentally oversharing. Same thing here. Choose the permissions that's selected by default for sharing links. If you set it to view and somebody goes to share, then it prevents them from accidentally oversharing. If they want to share with edit permissions, which means allow the person that they're sharing with to actually make changes rather than just looking at it. If you don't want them to have that edit, then you should default to view. And then if you want to do it with edit, then they have to actually go in and change it when they share it. They have to say, yes, make this and edit share. All right, couple of other things here. Choose expiration date and permission options for any one links. And what we mean by this is something that's shared so anyone has the link to it. We can expire that link after a set number of days. Now, I really like that idea because it makes it so you don't share something and then 6 months later somebody else comes across the link and reaccesses the document when you didn't intend to. So I like that expiration as a good security option. All right, these links can give these permissions. We can, for anonymous, we can limit it to view instead of view and edit. For folders, we can set it to view instead of view, edit, upload. These are going to be for those anyone who has a link can access this type of shares. And then 3 more. Show owners the names of people who viewed their files in OneDrive. Let site owners choose to display the names of people who viewed pages or files in SharePoint. Use short links for sharing files and folders. These first 2 are just kind of a good little monitoring option. So remember, these are default settings for sharing for everything. Now, they can be overridden when you go to share from a particular site or when you go to share a particular file. So before we jump into access control, let's go back to sites. I'm going to go to an active site and I'm going to go to my sales site. So here under policies, we have our external sharing. This site can be shared with new and existing guests. So I'm going to click edit and you'll see here our options for sharing. The sharing settings available depend on your organizational level settings. And so here's where I can choose what I want to be able to share off of this site. So I can have some sites with more permissive sharing than other sites. And that is actually, that's a very, very good feature. And you'll notice a lot of the same things that we set, right? So we have external sharing, anyone, new and existing guests only. Advanced sharing settings, limit by domain, default sharing type. Now, this is where we get to the defaults. So we can choose for sharing from this site, and that's this site only. We can choose to use the same as the organizational specific defaults, or I can set a different default for this site. Whoops, didn't mean to check that again. All right, and so now this becomes a default for sharing off of this site. So remember, you've got the organizational level settings and then the site level settings. And the site level settings, you can use the organizational defaults or you can modify them. Okay, let's come back to access control. So share policies, we have the sharing policies, now we have the access control policies. So here are access control policies. Unmanaged devices restrict access from devices that aren't compliant or joined to domain. Idle session timeout, network location, apps that don't use modern authentication. So we can select any one of those and choose to allow or block access. So I can choose to block access to any apps that don't use modern authentication. So basically it's Office 2010 or previous other versions or other software packages that don't have that type of authentication. Network location, I can allow access only from specific IP addresses. If I turn that on, then I have to set the IP addresses. Notice a note, make sure your IP address is listed so you don't block yourself out. You can do it by address range. So you'll see some examples here using slash notation for address ranges for both IPv4 and IPv6. So oops, I did not want to leave that. Good, I didn't. Idle session timeout, unmanaged devices. All right, so all of these are for, and notice, by the way, for the unmanaged devices, you need enterprise mobility plus security in order to do that. You got to upgrade your subscription. Okay, so those are some basic policy settings. Let's also take a look at settings down here. And here you're going to see settings both for SharePoint, that's what this icon is, and for OneDrive. And you'll see a few other ones here. So this isn't so much the security, although some of these things kind of relate to it, right? Like notifications. Select this setting to allow users of the SharePoint mobile app to receive notifications about SharePoint site activity. They can turn it off if they don't want to. Allow or disallow. Do we want to use the default admin center or the classic, which is the older admin center? So you could select that as a default. SharePoint pages, some basic settings, allow users to create modern pages, allow commenting on modern pages. So a handful of other settings here that you can work with as well. Most of your security ones are going to fall into the policies here, and so that's what we really need to be aware of. The rest of it is just choosing what we want to allow or disallow. Okay. So that was a real quick, about 13-minute overview of some of our policies and settings that are available in SharePoint. And hopefully you got to see that you can actually do a lot of intense customization here. Different sites with different policies, different security settings, depending on what information is going to be maintained in that site. SharePoint is a very flexible, very powerful tool. And it's one that not everybody takes advantage of. But the ability to have shared portals can actually become very useful for different working groups within your organization. Just to give you an example, I'm working on a project at the school that I teach at Yakima Valley College, and I'm creating a SharePoint site to store documents because I'm having to coordinate between a bunch of different people. There's me, there's other instructors, there's people from facilities, there's people from tech services. So I'm creating a site and inviting everybody into this site where we'll be able to share resources, share documentation. I made a list of things that have to be completed. We can set priorities. We can assign tasks to specific people. So lots of different capabilities in SharePoint. That's something that's definitely worth you spending some time to explore.